Hello, I'm Carol Willis. I'm the founder and director of the Skyscraper Museum, and I'm going to lead this walking tour today of the business core of Battery Park City, what originally was called the World Financial Center when it was built from about 1983 to 1986, and today is renamed Brookfield Place.
Today, this is the second, it's actually the second year that we've done these talks. And so here's the context that we're going to look at the history of Battery Park City. It's a way of contrasting the historic, organic financial district and the buildings that grew up over time from Bowling Green and the first fort through the continuous development in the vertical of high-rise buildings that became this kind of ground, well, I won't use ground zero, but the kind of, heavy center of the expression of New York as the capital of capitalism. And that identity of Lower Manhattan is in its bedrock in a lot of senses is dramatically different than the master planned new community on new land, on landfill of Battery Park City. So that if we just look at a few of these images here back before 9/11, you can see and I'll talk about it at greater length as we walk around, the reason that Battery Park City is here is the World Trade Center for a number of reasons. The finger piers that had been, and you're looking in the 1950s or so at this photograph, extended out into the water, and they form the outside edge of what became the new land of Battery Park City. So these finger piers, technologically obsolete by the 1950s or so because containerization had replaced cargo that came into port like this, and all the different uses, whether it was ferries or lighterage for these piers, was pretty much out of date. But the overall master plan, the concept to create new land in the river, which you can't do anymore because this was in 1964, and then through the end of the 60s, the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act were passed in the late 1960s. So you can't add anything in the water anymore. So this was the kind of last gasp of New York extending its boundaries into the water. So you see the cofferdams here. And they are taking some of the landfill that comes out of the site of the World Trade Center right here. So as you may know, what's called the bathtub of the World Trade Center is about 16 acres, and it's 70 feet deep. There were more than 1 million cubic tons of earth that was going to be hauled away, but instead of hauled away, it was dumped into the river here in order to make the first kind of increment or first segment of the Battery Park City new land. And this is 1969 here. By 1973, you can see that the south neighborhood up to the marina that we're seeing right here, the marina, and still piers on the north end haven't been filled in yet. So this was a staged development because it's a massive job. It's 92 acres of new land. And you can see here over, by the way, the Skyscraper Museum is right there at the southern end, right, very close to Pier A, which was the southernmost pier that the city owned. So by 1984, all the landfill had been completed, but not many of the buildings. The first tour looked at the first section to be developed according to a master plan that was designed in 1979 by Cooper Exted. And this kind of little mini town of different roof levels and different kind of massing, it was all new. It was an instant city, but it was scaled down, certainly from the size of the World Trade Center, but very much smaller and kind of diminutive compared to the next wave after the 1990s of the development. So there were adjustments to the master plan and what you were allowed to build. And I'm not going to talk about everything right here, but I want to talk about the Battery Park City Authority and how that was established in order to create the bonding power to make the money so that the landfill could be finished, and the infrastructure put in order to prepare the ground for ground leases that were then offered to developers who would build the housing, basically housing, because this was conceived of as a new neighborhood, right? Its raison d'etre was residential, but we're in the commercial core, and the commercial core was going to help pay for the whole project. Commercial buildings, skyscrapers, generate the largest amount of revenue and pilot funds, payment in lieu of taxes to the city of New York. So we'll look at this again later, but this is the first housing that was added, and you can see that in its character, it looks a little bit like, whatever, Co-op City or Starrett City, something. It's built by the Lafracs, who were kind of middle-income developers, and they were the only ones to bid on this property back in the early 1980s. So it took through the 1990s, and then even after 9/11, that the residential blocks became attractive enough to developers for them to decide that they wanted to invest in this whole project. And meanwhile, the infrastructure was being established by the Battery Park City Authority. So this is Battery Park right here, and the World Financial Center, as this area, which is now called Brookfield Place, which was originally called, was on the other side of the financial district, most especially the other side of West Street, which was this physical barrier, 8-lane highway for a while, with the West Side Highway elevated above it, which was, even more noxious, unsightly, and, dangerous. So I think that's enough to say about the kind of preliminaries, because I would like to walk outside and look at the marina and the reason that this kind of water feature is there, and explain that to you. And then we can look at the skyscrapers above us and talk a little bit about the postmodern design of the 4 matching towers designed by Cesar Pelli of Pelli Clark Pelli, that are the matched set of kind of boxy towers. That I'll talk about more in detail when we're actually looking at them. But the thing I want you to look at here is the public space that surrounds it, because this was certainly a part of the overall design. It was part of the concept. It was Battery Park City Authority's authority of hiring the master planners and creating the spaces which were designated as the kind of outdoor rooms. With a financing structure that I'll explain later, the public spaces are paid for by the Battery Park City Authority. The infrastructure of the roads and the plumbing and the electricity and everything is paid for by the Battery Park City Authority. But the revenue stream that's going to be created by these future office buildings and residential buildings were the idea of the continuing health and eventual build out of Battery Park City and its financial success, and indeed the affluence that is represented in the residential buildings down here. So, and just to make this point about the rooms, so you see the architects and the landscape architects' conception. They are designing the public spaces for the public, for everybody, whereas the towers are being designed for the developer, Olympia and York, the Reichman brothers, but for private companies who are going to want to rent a certain kind of space, financial services company that needed large trading floors and big floors for lots and lots of workers. So these buildings are very typical of their time. Their general massing that I'll talk about was established by the Battery Park City Authority that said, okay, there are 4 sites and you can put 1.3 million square feet on this building, and 900,000 square feet in this building, and then you had some freedom to design from that. But basically, the substitute for zoning in New York was set by the government, the Battery Park City Authority, here in Battery Park. Here's what the Winter Garden looked like when it was first finished. And you can see the palm trees look the same, obviously different palm trees, but there was this is still dark in its ironwork, but the columns were darker. That's the principal change that you see here. The stairs since 9/11 have been changed. And you can see what it looked like on the evening of 9/11 when the World Trade Center had crashed down and cut off the eastern end of the Winter Garden, and it had taken out some portions of the adjacent buildings. So kind of a miracle that they survived it at all, but here it goes with the exterior structural steel columns of the World Trade Center that fell straight down, but some of them kind of cascaded a little bit onto the neighboring buildings. So as a consequence of that, there have been some relatively minor changes in the buildings themselves, and then the access under West Street to the Ground Zero site, the World Trade Center site, and to the PATH trains. So PATH trains is the reason to now go outside and to talk about that kind of imperative or constraint or rationale for the space. Let's go out and look at the marina. We'll go out through here. You're looking at the marina and the opening there that makes it a lovely feature of the that opens up to the waterfront, that gives activity to the area, that houses yachts and commercial boats, as you see here. That was always part of the plan in the landscape drawing, landscape architecture drawing that I showed you. But the reason that the marina is here is not aesthetic. It's the railway tubes, the tunnels that for the Manhattan Hudson railroads, which went into default and were saved by the Port Authority of New York, and became renamed the Port Authority Trans-Hudson, tunnels. PATH comes in right here. The tunnels come in right underneath the marina, so that you couldn't put skyscraper footings down through there. That space had to remain clear, so they turned it into the yacht harbor, as you can see here, and they go right through and under these buildings into the World Trade Center site. They always did. And indeed, when the Trade Center was still being constructed and people were still transiting, commuters were going back and forth, they held those tunnels up on bridges, on like a pilotis, to go through the air and into eventually, the adjacent PATH station, but on kind of the same level as the Trade Center foundations. So there's a lot of, as we'll see over there, a lot of below ground level infrastructure. The ground is 8 stories high on the World Trade Center site. So we're going to walk out into the sunshine a little bit in order to look south at the Gateway Plaza and then back at these towers. But while we're here under the shade, I just want to try and call attention to all the landscaping features like the fountains and the formal gardens that are over that corner. These restaurants with their terraces are very much a kind of artifact of the established in the 1980s by like urban festival markets. And if you think of South Street Seaport, which was saved temporarily by the Rouse Corporation in order to reinvent it as a place where people would want to come when they're, whether it's the bridge and tunnel crowd coming over to experience the, kind of the density of downtown. But this idea of a developer making a place that's fun to come was really a reinventing the city kind of mindset, and a real contrast to the urban renewal mentality of, you know, kind of clean everything, bulldoze it out, raise it up, make it clean, utilitarian, serve the largest numbers, but not thinking in the kind of Jane Jacobs way of, you know, the city as activated streets, as fun, as diversity of variety and everything. So reinventing that kind of active urbanism was very much a part of the initial concept of Battery Park City's public spaces. So let's walk down here. So you can see back in 1984 how these towers, the Gateway Towers, have been, I think 3 of them finished at the time. And here it looks like they were always part of a larger plan, but you can see that back in 1982, they were isolated. You know, they looked like some beachhead defenses on Normandy Beach or something like that. They're concrete. They're a little severe. The Battery Park City Authority was desperate to get some housing in here, you know, to kind of prime the pump of a neighborhood. And so they did not follow the same guidelines that were later established for other neighborhoods that, you know, in the South, where we already walked in our first tour, or the North neighborhood, which we're going to do at the end of the month, and then in early August, where a palette of brick and stone bases and the kind of traditional materiality of neighborhoods like, you know, Gramercy Park or West End Avenue or something was very specifically cited by the designers of what they wanted to create a kind of enforced harmony, but some variety, some play within that. So these look absolutely nothing like that, and they are very inward turning. At Gateway Plaza, when you go, you come in, you have to almost drive in. You can certainly walk in now, but they were serviced by cars mostly because they're so hard to get to. So you come into this kind of little fortress area. So they're very inward turning. They look out for views, but they're very inward turning in order to make what in the 80s people called defensible spaces, right? So that you could control a point of access and make them feel secure.
I'm sorry, I lost one. You're saying, but talking about materiality in places like Gramercy Park, you're saying this is very different or very similar? I got lost.
So every place but these towers in Battery Park City, these are not like the materiality. I mean, they've got their own material, which is, you know, kind of exposed concrete. Whereas the rest of Battery Park City is built of reinforced concrete, but it has facades of beige and brick and always punch windows or ribbon windows that are limited to the percentage of the area of the wall that by Battery Park City Authority that you're allowed to use for windows. So not floor to ceiling glass, not looking like office buildings. So not the kind of the high modernist sensibility, but something which looks more like what they thought of as traditional New York.
Right. Thank you. That was extremely
helpful. So you see there are these kind of plateaus of sandboxes and absolutely nothing else. So this is not the tour for the residential neighborhoods. That's tour 1 and tour 3. Here we're just looking at the commercial core. So this is really the driver of, this is the engine for the economy of Battery Park City, creating the revenues. And wow, you see what glass does to you. I thought that you'd think the sun was right there from the way that I can feel the heat on my face. But yeah, glass gives you a very different kind of materiality or dematerialized than stone facades do. But speaking of stone facades, you see that the 4 towers match each other very much, and they're, well, absolutely, they match themselves completely in the the granite facades, the color banding, the square windows that you see in the first 20 or so stories. And then you can see as they rise, and there are a series of kind of really artificial setbacks that like zigzag back as they step up. That is very characteristic of 1920s buildings in New York, and it's mandatory within the 1916 New York zoning law, and we'll see an example of that when we walk over to the other side and we look at Ralph Walker's telephone building, the New York telephone building. But in the 1980s, the One Chase Manhattan Plaza, or the Seagram building, kind of prismatic glass boxes, the kind of minimalist modernism, was being challenged by a movement that was called postmodernism. So rejecting that really simple, elegant modernist sensibility, especially of glass and steel, and here replacing it with stony references to the 1920s architecture, like Chrysler Building has got bricks on the outside of the facade, right? And all of those little step backs are referenced here too. As I mentioned, the massing of about 40 to 50-story towers in the 4 buildings was all prescribed by the Battery Park City Authority. And there was only one developer who bid on the entire project, and that was Olympia in York. It was the Reichman family from Montreal. And the Battery Park City Authority's intention was there'd be 4 different developers, and the 4 sites would each be developed by the sensibility of a different developer who would hire a different architect, and that would look more like New York, where you owned a block and you build a building, or you owned a quarter of a block and you build a building, so that you get this heterogeneous mix, which is very characteristic of New York. And this was not what they wanted, but again, it's what they got. And they were able to move forward from about 1983 with this project. So finished in 86, it was, as you saw in some of the earlier photographs, again, a centerpiece of a table setting which had not been completely developed. But it was right next to the World Trade Center, right? And the massing of these towers were supposed to step down, as Cesar Pelli called them, like a series of foothills going up to the giants of the World Trade Center. So everything about the overall design was controlled and determined by the master plan overseen by the Battery Park City Authority. Let's get out of the sun now, go back, and we're going to walk to the other side, the World Trade Center side of the complex, and look at other skyscrapers. But as we pass, we want to take a look at the Goldman Sachs building that you see there, designed by Harry Cobb, which was added after, I think it's about 2005 or 7. So it's kind of neo-modernism rather than postmodernism. It's 20 years after the Pelli buildings. So here again for the overview of what it looked like, actually just before 9/11 in 2001. So you see the relationship of these kind of half-height towers, 4 of them. 4 of these don't begin to compete with the amount of space that was provided in even one of the World Trade Center towers. So when the Twin Towers were finished in 1971 and 1974, you're seeing them here in 1973. They're occupied, ready to take tenants in 1974. They were, the first one, the tallest building in the world. In the meantime, the Sears Tower in Chicago went a little bit taller before the Tower 2 of the World Trade Center was finished. But the point is that they were 200 feet on the side, basically an acre of space. There were 110 stories in each one of them, so 110 acres times 2, 220 acres of office space. Battery Park City, which is a mile long, is 92 acres, right? There's an immense amount of space. They were an immensely ambitious project, and they were, in that ambition, typical of the 1960s, the scale of operation of either urban renewal or the moonshot, kind of believing that, technology will advance and we should take advantage of those things and build bigger and better. was a part of the mindset of that era. So the scale of Battery Park City and the height of the world and the overall size of the World Trade Center are comparable, I guess you'd say. The Twin Towers had each one of them 4.5 million square feet of space in them, so 9 million altogether in the two towers, which is bigger than most downtowns of kind of second-tier American cities. And when the World Financial Center then added space, you can see that they have large floor plates, but there were hardly any buildings with as large a floor plate as the World Trade Center, and certainly as many floors. But you can see that they were servicing the same kind of ideal big floor plate that was typical of what large companies wanted at the time, 30 or 40,000 square feet of space where you have all your people on one floor together, right? And especially with the World Financial Center, as it was called, that tells you what their clients were. They were financial services company, American Express and Merrill Lynch. They had trading floors at the bottom, which were big open floors too, and then they had hundreds of traders, which would be on a single floor. So this is a kind of corporate workplace organization, which is now changing. Whether it's COVID or not, it already was changing, so that somewhat smaller floor plates were found. But in the meantime, or at the same time, migration to suburbs and suburban office parks were the things that were challenging cities for having marketable space. So if we then kind of look across the way at, thank you, where the whole site of the World Trade Center, we can see here from its north end, and where one World Trade Center rises, that was the north end of the site, and there were lower rise buildings there. And as you know, the footprints of the north and south towers are just over there, and they're preserved by the memorials, the memorial fountains. So One World Trade Center got moved to the north for various reasons because of security and other considerations, basically security considerations. And the master plan that has been fulfilled to this point are Towers 3, Tower 2, which would be just to the north of the Oculus with its wings, its rising wings there. That kind of central space that is the kind of Grand Central Concourse for the PATH trains, but also I think a kind of memorial to spirit, I suppose, on the site. Cultural buildings where you see white and a marbled facade of the Performing Arts Center. Culture was part of the imperative in the rebuilding of the Trade Center site because the towers, so Tower 2, as I started to say, would be just to the north of the Oculus, but it hasn't been built yet because you build these one at a time and hope that they fill up, and you don't start until you have an anchor tenant, and then you can go ahead. And they had sort of an anchor tenant that then disintegrated, and so that tower is just a footprint and may rise who knows when. But Tower 3 and 4, and here's a case where each by a different architect. So SOM, Roger Cirque, and Maki are the 3 towers that are completed, and there's Norman Foster, and then Big, and now it's Norman Foster again for Site 2. Yeah, that's where they've tipped back towards Foster. Yeah, they're not building it yet, so who knows what it will be. But at the moment, the idea that was original for World Financial Center, that there be 4 complementary, was actually carried out on the Trade Center site under Silverstein, under a single developer, Silverstein, who agreed with his architect David Childs that they should be different. There should be different architects, not some kind of overwhelming monumentality that conforms to each other. The Leapskin, no, because the Leapskin didn't have anything to do with the commercial towers, right? So he did the master plan and he cited the skyscrapers, but how much space would be on each site, and that really wasn't his purview at all. People think that it was, but and his images kind of embedded that idea in a lot of people's minds, but he was only designing the site and not the memorial either, of course. But the Freedom Tower, as he named it, is what they used to call the One World Trade Center. And there were many stages to get to this one that included Leapskin and then dropped away. So looking beyond then the World Trade Center site, if you cast your eye to diagonally there, so like 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock, you see Wall Street marked by the towers of the kind of stepped pyramid is the very top of the Bankers Trust building, is right on the corner of Wall and Nassau and Broad Street. And behind that, a little bit farther, is the 20 Exchange on Exchange Place. And closer to us, actually, the tallest one over on the left is on Broadway. That's 120 Broadway, the Equitable Building. And the one that is the tallest, but you maybe see it over from this side, a stony tower that's kind of steps up at its top. That's Ralph Walker, that we're going to look at, who is also the architect of the more humble skyscraper in beige brick, but that one for the Irving Trust Bank is called One Wall Street, and it's being converted now to residential by Maclo Properties. So the tallest of the buildings off the World Trade Center site are really the subject of our exhibition, Residential Rising, because they're all apartment buildings, right? They're in fact, they're condo buildings. The one that is the most mundane, that in kind of white glass, that actually is a hotel, W Hotel, but since fallen on hard times. But the very slender one that still has its construction elevator on the outside and with the sleek glass kind of streamlined and wrapped around is a condominium tower that was designed by Raphael Vignoli, who also designed up on Billionaires Row, 432 Park Avenue, the white gridded building. And slenderness is the characteristic of both the architecture and engineering, but also the development strategy of buildings like this, which sit on tiny little lots but use air rights transferred from adjacent properties in order to pile up very tall. So that building gets tall because it's consumed the air rights of a landmark building that's contiguous site, and purchased air rights on a site no larger than like 80 by 100 feet to go to 1,000 feet high. So it's got a rate, like a slenderness ratio of 1 to 10, which is hard to build, and you need a good structural engineer in order to do that. Another tall tower, also very glassy and banded in horizontally in stainless steel, is the residential 50 West Street. So on this West Street right here, the highway, by the kind of out ramp of the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel. And others that you see this way, so similarly glassy building, the one that is kind of flares to the top a little bit, designed by KPF, and it's called 111 Murray Street, is also in our exhibition, where you have floor-to-ceiling vision glass, and it is supposed to look like kind of champagne glasses, a flute, very elegant, very, very minimal. So you see the difference between the reference to traditional architecture, the use of materials, versus a kind of modernist mantra of glass and steel and very fine kind of minimalist expression of form. That's correct. What you can see from here is this very ornamented, frilly Gothic cornice of a brave little building, what's called 90 West Street by its address, but it is the same architect as, you can't see her from here, but the Woolworth Building. So Cass Gilbert, who designed that before the Woolworth Building, was specialized in terracotta ornament. He did classical as well, but you know, there were two of these Gothic, neo-Gothic buildings. And it was almost completely destroyed by 9/11, except for the shell. But being in terracotta, an early 20th century building, the whole inside burned out, but it was like a pizza oven. It was, you know, it survived. And so it has been beautifully restored by the Kibble companies, and it's residential, right? So it's another one of these shifting uses to creating a neighborhood, which was the raison d'etre of Battery Park City, is to create a neighborhood adjacent to the financial district. I want to look, presumably you're familiar with One World Trade Center. I won't talk about it that much. David Childs of Skidmore, Owings & Merrill is the architect there. And if you look right through the street here, through the little slot, you can see the piling up of a series of towers. The little green cupolas that you see, that's the top of the tallest building in the world, office building, real building that you occupied and you worked in 1899. It's the Park Row building. And you can see that it is made, it's dwarfed by towers immediately behind it, both of which are residential, the one with the little wireframe pinnacle on it. And then also in our exhibition, the one that has the beige verticals, and then the balconies that cantilever, that's called 25 Park Row. And then one behind it, you can just catch a glimpse of the Frank Gehry, it's now called 8 Spruce Street. It had a lot of names before that, but I think an underappreciated masterpiece by Frank Gehry, who's, you know, arguably the world's greatest living architect. Another SOM building, 7 World Trade Center, looks very modest here, but is a really elegant design. But we want to look at this 1920s building by Ralph Walker. So it is the New York Telephone building. It's one of them because Walker designed a whole group of towers, the Long Lines building, the others that are closer to Canal Street. And they're utilitarian buildings, steel frame underneath, of course, brick facades, punch windows, as we call them, and that's what I was referring to. What Cesar Pelli was referencing in his square patterning of the windows in that granite and glass curtain wall that he creates for World Financial Center. But here, these windows open and close in order to ventilate the space. They're large enough to let light in for working in the interior. But the bottom of this building was always switching, right? This is really an industrial building for the telephone company, where operators would take the little, you know, cables and the connectors, and you put them in the switchboard in order to let your long distance calls come through. So this was really like a loft building in the garment district. It was a working building with lots of machinery in it. And people worked in the top, and there was a set of executive floors in the very top, and boardrooms and all of that. And it's decorated at the top, and you can see really beautifully by carved stone. But in its base, it's a very modest and economical building, shaped absolutely by the site, which is not a perfect rectangle, and more importantly, in 3 dimensions, by the 1916 zoning law, which requires that buildings step back after a certain height, and then can rise to unlimited height. This one didn't go all that tall, but to unlimited height on a quarter of the site. So that accounts for the tower here, or any of the towers that you see around Wall Street. And the other thing that shaped it is the necessity of light to illuminate the interior space back in the days before fluorescent lights and cheap, cool electrical light. And so the light courts that penetrate here, so these buildings have, you know, kind of 2 projecting wings, that's so daylight illuminates the workspace. So it's a combination of the technology of the time, the constraints of municipal zoning that shaped these buildings for into a characteristic style in New York.
I'm going to tell us what year was this again?
It was designed in 24, it was finished in 26. Okay, you get a really good view of KPF's glassy tower, and you can see how it's floor-to-ceiling vision glass here, so it's continuous skin of glass is quite different than the treatment, the kind of rationalization of the window unit that you see in the Harry Cobb Goldman Sachs building. So let's walk back this way a little bit. From here, you can see from the outside the ensemble of buildings that are the original World Financial Center. Now, we were talking on the way over, Brookfield is, a big real estate company. It's a REIT, a real estate investment trust. So they have brought a different kind of tenant back to these buildings post 9/11. They've also retrofitted the interior spaces, made sure that they're up to 21st century standards, and they're trying to keep them all alive and generate more activity. You can see there a different kind of, somewhat different than kind of urbanism and shopping than this little pavilion, which was actually added by a different architect in order to create a streetscape which has a kind of intimacy to it. And if the Shake Shack's down at the other end, and you can get your pizza and a little delicatessen. So not the kind of corporate big store, chain store identity, but something which is supposed to be a little more neighborhood feel to it. And zoning does that in the city at large, but Battery Park City tried to think through the elements of what would be needed. But because I haven't emphasized it that much on this tour because it's the commercial core, but we will look next time much more in the North neighborhood at the Irish Hunger Memorial, which is just down there, right? And then the Esplanade and the connection to the river and the water, and the 25% of Battery Park City, which is parks, and parks that are maintained by the Battery Park City Authority by revenues that are generated from the commercial project of residences and skyscrapers. So this kind of cross subsidy of capitalism for public good has a lot of skepticism in the world of academia, at least today. It's called neoliberalism generally. Public-private partnerships are scorned as a bad solution to what should be public responsibility. But, Battery Park City is pretty much built out. It is a demonstrable financial success in terms of generating revenues. There's always issues. There are issues that we talked about in the very first walk, and we'll talk about again in the third tour, resiliency and dealing with the expense of accommodating and climate change, and what will happen if we don't do something about flooding. Superstorm Sandy was a warning for that for sure. So actually our south neighborhood is going to, in just a month or so, begin to undergo massive excavation and then actually raise the park level 12 feet above on the street on the other side from the Skyscraper Museum. So it's interesting to have, as I have observed Battery Park City for these 25 years, because the idea that government is really the only entity that can take big sweeping action is the whole raison d'etre for Battery Park City. And it's the coming together of forces like New York State and Nelson Rockefeller as the governor, and David Rockefeller is the head of a large bank, but also a group of let's say Downtown Lower Manhattan Association of financial entities that were necessary in order to come together for the master plan to be affected by the engine of economics that capitalism provides. So however much skepticism you have about public-private partnerships, Battery Park City, I think, is actually a demonstration of how you can build value out of nothing, right? out of absolutely nothing, with a well-considered scheme that's flexible enough to adapt over, one decade to the next into a new set of guidelines. And ultimately, one hopes to listen to what the people who then move down here have to say. In the first iteration of this, the first decades of this, there wasn't anybody's opinion to ask yet, right? And they had a lot of leeway to affect the plans that they got some money to realize. But now they have to adjust to parents and all kinds of new demands that they even if they anticipated, didn't know maybe would be as vocal as they are, plus climate change and everything else. So in all the years that I've been leading students around Battery Park City, it's grown much more into a neighborhood. To see people walking on the streets rather than digital models and a rendering, which never even aspired to have as many people as you see here right now, is a pretty remarkable success. So next time, I certainly suggest, if you're not down here often, that you walk over to the river, because that is also the reason to justify Battery Park City, is the continuous public access to the waterfront that it creates in beautiful parks. So thank you for coming. Thanks. Thank you. Thanks for coming.